everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm here on Classic Reads again with Mark Tiedemann, and today our classic read is Nightfall by Isaac Asimov, originally published in 1941. So, Mark, you want to tell us a little bit about Nightfall?
Oh, Nightfall is one of the perennial classics everybody is taught to think of as a representative of the golden age of science fiction. And, most of those stories, in one way or another, do actually earn their reputations, and this one is no exception. It still reads well. You kind of have to make allowances for the fact that it was written and published in 1941. And science fiction had a long way to go to acquire all the bells and whistles of the sophistication we expect today. But the central idea is interesting, and Asimov followed it through admirably. And to my surprise, the psychology that he exhibited in that story tracks very well. It touches on a lot of things sociologically, and so it is one that I recommend reading. Asimov is one of my perennial favorites. It's Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy is the story that made me want to be a writer. Um, and I reread that a couple years ago too, and it's starting to wear a little thin because, again, this is something that he began publishing those in the 40s. And they really, it's not so much that they were loath to mess with the social background. I don't think it occurred to them to mess with the social background so much. But Nightfall appeared in the September issue of Astounding Science Fiction in 1941. It was in an issue with good company. The last installment of Robert A. Heinlein's Methuselah's Children was in that issue. And another classic from Alfred Bester, Adam and No Eve, was in that issue. Asimov himself thought that they would overshadow Nightfall and nobody'd think twice about it. As with so many things, when you hear the writer talk about their own work, he was wrong. Nightfall had legs because I think at its heart, it talks to a perennial fear that probably haunts every civilization, the collapse thereof.
Yeah, and in 1941, for those maybe a little bit younger than us, World War II was 2 years old at the time. I mean, U.S. hadn't entered it yet. We didn't enter until December of 41. But at this point, we were still on the sidelines, but it had been going on for 2 years. So end of civilization was probably on, people's minds.
Oh, yeah. Asimov was aware of it. Asimov published a memoir, the autobiography, in a 2-volume edition back in the 80s, I believe. And he was a meticulous diarist. So he's got all the dates. He records the newspapers that he was reading and the headlines of the day, and everybody was paying attention to what was going on in Europe. Or if not everybody, at least people who read. And the other thing that, how that impinged on all of you could actually say that had something to do with Heinlein's Methuselah's Children, because the central thesis of that was a group of special people. They were different from everybody else, and the government found out about them and began rounding them up to treat them badly, and they make an escape. Arguably, World War II was all about the consequences of treating special groups badly. So the social commentary was there to be read if you cared to read it. Some interesting details about the genesis of Nightfall. Asimov lived in New York. Astounding was a product of the Street and Smith Company, and they were headquartered in New York. And Asimov, like so many other writers of the day, a lot of the early science fiction writers lived in New York, or at least in New Jersey. They could just walk into the editorial offices and sit down with the editor, who at that point was John W. Campbell, and spitball story ideas. And Asimov, but when he came to write Nightfall, he'd already written 31 stories and sold 17 of them. He was on his way, as they say. He was anxious about the fact that he hadn't yet made it into the big leagues. I think his own assessment was off. People respected him. Campbell certainly respected him, but the idea for Nightfall was Campbell's idea. And when I say that, it's not like Campbell had a plot. He had found a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, which appears at the beginning of the story, about if the stars only appeared once every 1,000 years, et cetera, et cetera. And he liked that quote. He gave it to Asimov and said, I want a story about what happens if this is actually the case. The stars only come out once every 1,000 years. What would happen? And Asimov went home, and the next day he started writing the story. He finished it on April 8th, and he took it into Campbell on the 9th. Campbell read it, asked for one revision, which Asimov did, and then it was accepted on April 24th for the grand total of $166 for a 13,000-word story, which was a lot of money for him.
I saw like the equivalent would be like $3,500 a day, which I've certainly never made $3,500 for a short story.
Yeah, basically. And it appeared, as I say, in the September issue, which came onto the stands in August the 15th.
So the basic premise of this is the civilization has 6 stars, and so that's never dark, right?
Right.
And the archaeologists have discovered that every 2,000 years, civilization appears to collapse and then rebuild itself. Yep. So they've got this mystery of why civilization got this weird periodicity to it. And so finally they start to figure out it's because the stars come out, but no one's ever seen a star, right? So they don't know what this really means.
Yeah.
What is a star?
There's a cult that keeps this idea alive.
And so they're trying to figure out it's been 2,000 years. If this happens again, they start trying to figure out how they're going to survive. And like many science fiction movies, it starts off with people ignoring the scientists, right? So
and it's a curious civilization because you think, okay, they don't ever have night on this world. There's never a point where daylight is absent. So what about when they go indoors? I mean, okay, they're at the level of having candle technology for indoor lighting. It's not remarked that much, but the scientists in question have these special, 3-foot long candles that they use toward the end of the story. But they seem to have motorized vehicles of some kind. They're mentioned, cars are mentioned. There's a whole series of little technological, what? How come this doesn't add up? But Asimov played this rather neatly to suggest that this was a civilization that had developed fairly high mathematics. They clearly had some form of calculus because they finally have calculated when the eclipse is going to come that will plunge the world into total darkness. And their astronomy, they have photography because they're taking pictures of everything while this is all going on. But they have print newspapers. So it's a weird congeries of mismatched technologies. That's not the point of the story, of course, but it's one of the things that could kick people out today because they would look at that and say, well, why didn't they think of this? You have to read this with it in mind that this came out in 1941. And they had already done experiments. There was a psychologist that is part of the team of scientists preparing for this, and he relays that we've done some experiments. There was a circus exhibit called the Tunnel of Mystery, which was a mile-long tunnel that's absolutely dark, and people would buy a ticket to ride this thing, and they'd come out the other end. It was a 15-minute ride, and some people would come out screaming. Some people would come out seeming perfectly normal, but they would never go inside again. And of a whole host of psychological breakdowns that people suffered from having the shock of being in an environment with absolutely no light. Now, this is kind of a blunt instrument approach to psychology, because we know now there are always exceptions to every rule. There are always going to be people that don't conform to some mass standard, but they didn't play with that so much back then. The homogeneity of some of these stories is kind of remarkable, and this is no exception. But it's a short story or a novelette, and it makes its point very quickly, that there can be events, the cosmic events, that are so stunning that it could cause a complete collapse in confidence, and a civilization could come to a halt.
Yeah, and it seems
Um,
like, because I think they calculate the eclipse is only going to be like for half a day or something. I mean, it's not
yes, it's not going to be that
to the
damn long,
reader.
but
You're like, okay, so 6 hours of darkness. How bad can it be, right? Um, so, but for the people who've never experienced dark, except if they go in a cave, but apparently they can't go in a cave for even 15 minutes.
yeah,
This is the
this
epitome of
is
what's terrible. And I think also because they think that people have theorized there might be other suns beyond the six that they know of, but of course they can't see beyond them because it's never
yeah.
dark.
They're talking about 8 or 9, and
Maybe, right? Because like we 100
yeah,
years ago, people were like, well, maybe there are other galaxies, right? Maybe there, and then suddenly we get Hubble looks out and there's like, oh, look, there's millions and millions of other galaxies, and suddenly ours is not just the only one, right? And so these people, when the terrible stars do come out, and they suddenly realize there's
yeah,
a whole universe out there. It's almost like, in a way, like in the Hitchhiker's Guidebooks, where Zaphod Beeblebrox goes into the machine. It's supposed to destroy your ego by showing you how small you are, right? Because it shows you're
yeah,
like this tiny speck, and there's a huge universe. Well,
yeah,
it's like they're inside that machine, and they're going insane because now they realize they're a little tiny speck in a huge universe when they thought they were the universe.
yeah. They relied heavily. Well, and how would they not? I mean, really, you're raised within your context, and it's given you as this is normal, and it doesn't change. And why would you suspect things would be different? Could be different, and you rely on that. Home is home. If you
Mhm.
strip the walls away and just take the roof away, you've taken away my home, and that's what happens in this story. Um, the thing that's interesting is that the cult that's also at the center of it, it keeps alive this tradition. They don't seem to have a god, but they believe in souls, and they don't actually want to have an explanation for the periodic collapses, because if you explain it, no one will then have faith. And he kind of nailed a perennial problem that
Mhm.
we have with people who just, you could call it the secularist problem of saying, well, what does the supernatural or the mystical have to do with this? There are reasons for this. This is math. This is physics. This is, you know, astronomical bodies moving around. It's impersonal. And as we are seeing today, unfortunately, there are always people who are willing to burn down the systems of knowledge
Mhm.
if they feel that their explanations to themselves are about to be set aside. Um, this
And yeah,
is not
we see that going on today,
much.
right? We don't want
Yeah, this is
to
what
talk.
we don't.
Why, if I can do 5 minutes of Google search and get that vaccines cause autism, then cool. But the body of millions of peer-reviewed journals and all the experts don't
Well,
count anything
obviously,
against
all
that,
the
right?
scientists are wrong. I found
Right.
this in 5 minutes, and obviously, it's not a quest for knowledge; it's a quest for validation, and that gets even more insistent in times of great stress. Um, there have been periodic collapses of civilizations in the historical records, particularly um, before the modern era, what we call BCE. There's 3 or 4 that we know about where things just, for whatever reason, fell apart.
Stopped.
And
Hmm.
they, they've always speculated on this, but there's been new research, new archaeology done that links, um, interestingly enough, climate change and mass migration directly to each period of civilizational collapse.
Hmm.
not the kind of climate change we're necessarily seeing now, but the kind regional climate change which suddenly, you can't grow crops anymore here. The soil won't support it, so the food supply is shut down. People pick up their stuff and they go looking for greener pastures, mass migration, and the civilizations that were around couldn't handle it. They couldn't absorb whatever it was. Those are now linked. And it just suggests that nature, because we don't understand it, and because a lot of people refuse to understand it, still has an outsized impact on our psychology. And that's what Asimov's story was all about. And he was 21 years old when he wrote this. And it was a gimmick story that he was handed by the editor that he respected and thought, okay, what kind of tricks can I pull out of this? And from his subconscious, he puts this thing out there that actually, the more you read it, has all kinds of insights for the problem of maintaining civilization. It's a rather remarkable achievement in that sense. And he doesn't let the scientists off the hook. He's telling this story through the eyes of a group of scientists that want to record the eclipse and all that stuff. And they're no more safe from the psychological effects of this thing than anybody else. As the last sun is eclipsed and darkness is falling, they're in the corner whimpering. It's when I first read this story back when I was like 12, I just thought, oh, that's a cool idea and all that. Now I've been a writer for the last 40 years, and I'm looking at the way he did this and going, wow, this is pretty damn sophisticated. And of course, Asimov was always a bright guy. He was no dummy. But it was his 31st to 32nd story that he'd written up to that point. He was really, pushing on it. And he'd already published a couple of robot stories, and he was about to publish his first Foundation story, and this one is sort of right in between those. And of course, Foundation is all about the collapse of civilization entirely. That is its major theme. Civilizations collapse. How do we avoid the Dark Ages? And in the case of this story, basically the message was you don't. Because
the scientists plan to save some people, right? But I think ultimately they don't get saved.
There's no comment as to whether or not that worked. One can imagine them coming out of hiding with all their stuff, and the crazed people that are still roaming around kill them.
Probably. It's like 28 days later, right?
Like 28 days
later. Cillian Murphy, you come out and go to London, there's nobody except the crazy zombies left, Yeah.
But now Campbell kind of screwed it up, and I'm actually surprised. I've got the story it's in volume 1 of the complete stories of Isaac Asimov. And Asimov himself complained that Campbell had sort of ruined it for him because he added a paragraph at the end that named Earth. Campbell was always doing that. Campbell was shameless. If he thought he could improve a story, he went in there and fiddled with it. It's one of the many reasons that he eventually lost his stable of writers.
Yeah. No one wanted their stories improved.
Well, you don't rewrite Robert A. Heinlein, basically. But he put it in there to make a comparison as to how many stars they would have seen on this last day. But Asimov left it in. I guess he decided that, well, it was published that way first, and that's the way people will expect it to be. So yeah. What else did I have?
Well, I like there was a story about, is it Niven, who every time someone asked him to sign a Mote in God's Eye, that he would there was some word the editor changed, like on page 200 and something, and he would find that word and change it back before he would sign the book or something.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, he was really upset about that one word change. And normally, usually editors don't change a whole lot like that, but anyway, so yeah, this story is kind of interesting because now sometimes I think, over the weekend, I'm thinking, is this the collapse of my civilization, right? Because now Iran and Israel are getting into it. And today our government couldn't decide if we were in on it or not, right? Because somebody said we weren't, and then Ted Cruz said we were, and then so the was it Tucker Carlson who was actually
Yeah,
pushing
Tucker
back on Ted?
Carlson owned
It was
them.
like and saying like, well, but so and so said that we were, and here you're saying that or we weren't, and then you say that we are helping, Israel or whatever. So it's like I who knows what's going on? Everybody has a
Yeah,
different story. And that happens in, not just today in the United States, but
yeah,
other places at different times. And it's like, okay, so what brings your civilization down, right? What is
yeah. Well, as I mentioned, there have been instances, we know that there have been instances where civilizations actually collapsed, um, were brought down. One of the biggies was around 1200 BC, and everything around the Mediterranean basin just basically shut
stopped?
down.
Yeah.
And a couple of hundred years later, all these new polities emerged. Well, Egypt didn't collapse, but apparently they had problems.
Hmm.
When you come into the modern era, um, starting with Rome, these collapses are not nearly as dramatic or total.
Hmm.
They're like, instead of collapses, they're major transformations. I mean, Rome arguably didn't collapse so much as the center of power shifted and
Hmm.
new groups replaced them, often with the same standards. I mean, was it the Visigoths? One of those groups, which ultimately ended up occupying where Carthage used to be, maintained a material civilization that was on par with Rome at its height. Um, Rome was in the descendant, and these were in the ascendant. Well, obviously, the Romans knew a little bit more about maintaining systems than these other people did, but it wasn't just a general collapse.
Hmm.
And as the last two millennia proceeded, those collapses looked more like regime change instead of just, people were still farming, people, goods and services had to. The last time we were close to something like that was World War II. It's arguable that if that hadn't ended when it did, we might have exhausted our resources and found ourselves entering a new dark age. But prior to that, the last time it looked like civilization was going to end was the 30 Years' War, which stunted Europe for over a century when that ended. But that also overlooks Asia. When we tend to talk about civilization collapsing, we keep talking about Western civilization and we ignore all those other ones.
Right.
They went through their ups and downs as well, and China itself exhibited a history of regime change more than simple collapse. Um, it would have to be a pretty damn big event.
Hmm.
Global nuclear war would do it.
Yeah. There's
Uh,
if you read Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, he has several very interesting graphs in there. And one of them is like the number of people who died in wars. And then they translate to like if there were 8 billion people then on the world like there were today, like how, well, because you're like, oh, a million people died 100 years ago. Oh, well, but they're like, oh, but there's only like, 1 billion people. So it'd be like, if 8 million people died today, or whatever. So, but the number one thing was something I'd never heard of, right? And it was the An Rebellion, which I believe was like in China back in the 13th
oh
century.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And the equivalent of like billions of people died.
It was
Like
huge. Yeah.
huge. And no one teaches that in school where I went to school, right? It seems like we should be learning about the war that killed off like a significant portion of the Earth's population, right? Because it's right. It's like there's nothing comes close, right? And you're right that in Europe the 30 Years' War was just like horrendous, and we don't even really learn about that in school either. But there's these huge conflicts that change so much, and we just and it's like let's have another class on Gettysburg or something. It's like, well, I've learned about Gettysburg every year for the past 10 years in school, but you're not going to hear about the 30 Years' War, the An Rebellion.
Yeah.
And they've done so much to change the face of humanity, right?
Yeah.
But so yeah, in this story we have a similar kind of thing, right? So that people are like, hey, every 2,000 years something happens, and our whole civilization looks like it just burns to the ground. And so that's kind of why I put this quote up here. The very last couple of lines of the story are about how the you can see the fires on the horizon.
Yeah.
And then the long night had come again. And of course, it's not a long night in terms of the eclipse. The eclipse is going to be a few hours long, right?
No,
But a
it's
long night in terms of it's going to be a long time before you have civilization again because
yeah.
it's already burning on the horizon. You can see the fires coming.
It's
So,
termed as the interregnum, which became a perennial in a lot of science fiction. Poul Anderson had his own version of the long night in his future history. Um, I think Gordon R. Dixon toyed with it. There's a few others that some conflict could be so horrendous that the lines of communication would be severed, and all of these worlds would be cut off, and people would die by the billions because all of that. But uh, this kind of thing, I think, it's dramatic, it's overblown, but its causes are often dramatized to take the mind off what really would do it. Um, I think it was Suzette Hayden Elgin wrote a short story once about the Civil War. If in fact Lincoln had died before he did, and Hannibal Hamlin became president, and the war itself dragged on another 4 years. And it wasn't the combat casualties that destroyed the country. It was the fact that every sanitary system that we had collapsed and the disease just took everybody.
mm,
That the fallout from the conflict is the one. And in the 30 Years' War, it's very similar. That's an example. Yeah, there were many armies in the field and all that, but the people that were dying in droves from epidemics
mhm.
that were unleashed at
Well,
the
it
time.
wasn't until like the Napoleonic Wars or something that more people died in battle than of disease.
Yeah,
It's
because
pretty
Napoleon
recent.
actually had a surgeon corps that
It invents
went out.
ambulances, right?
They had ambulance. Yeah, France is where modern medicine began, uh, because of war, of course. Um, but I think the idea that if you just take that as a metaphor, civilization is going to collapse. It doesn't have to be the kind of material collapse where buildings fall and cities crumble. It can just simply be something like, well, our set of priorities has been overturned, and we are now no longer capable of living the kind of lives we were before. You could even have a situation there where on the outside everything looks the same, but nothing's the same. I think science fiction has done a job portraying that kind of stuff, often, I think, in ways that are distracting, um, because we didn't really grapple with conflicting ideologies in science fiction until, well, it was starting in small increments at this period, but it didn't flower until the 60s and the new wave, which was all about how corrupt our systems were. Um, and the discussion continues to this day. Sociology has caught up in a lot of ways now. Pinker is interesting because I did read The Better Angels of our nature. Pinker is a hopeless optimist.
Mhm.
We need a few of those. I thought his number crunching was fascinating. That in point of fact, we are becoming less lethal to each other over time. Part of that is that there's more of us, and we're building thicker buffers between ourselves and that kind of imminent danger. I mean, it wasn't 300 years ago, and cities were automatically built with walls. Yeah, you didn't build a city with, I mean, what? Suburban sprawl? What? Are you crazy? What do you do when the army comes over the hill to attack you? Who's going to mount the bastions? Um, and some of it is, in fact, education, and some of it is just the fact that we're living in each other's backyards now. And unless you're willing to go to the mat and kill everybody in sight regularly, you have to start cooperating on some level.
Mhm.
So I agree with him. I don't think we're becoming necessarily more ethical. I don't think we're becoming more moral. I think it's becoming easier for us to be ethical and moral.
Mhm.
Uh, So, you threaten somebody's food supplies and you find out how fast that stuff goes by the wayside. Um, it's unfortunate, but we are animals and we strive to survive. Uh, but I think reading stories like Nightfall give us a clue that we shouldn't depend on the systems that seem to be working all the time. We should always kind of keep a wary eye out for what could cripple them. Um, and maybe we wouldn't be caught by surprise by things like what we're going through now.
Maybe not. All right. So, any final thoughts then before we wrap this up?
um, it is, in spite of the fact that sometimes the social background in a lot of these old science fiction stories can be cringeworthy because they really didn't tackle the idea that different technologies and situations would automatically demand different ways to live. They are worth reading as sort of modern parables. And occasionally you find some surprisingly good writing in a lot of these things. Asimov was uneven. Some of his stuff today is like, oh gosh, but he could be surprisingly trenchant. And this is a good example of where he really seemed to have everything clicking the way that it's supposed to be clicking. And don't forget the past. It's not that you're doomed to repeat the past, but you're doomed to have to learn everything all over again if you don't pay attention to what went before, and that's a slog.
That's right. We already did this, right?
Yeah, we already did this once. Why are we reinventing the wheel?
Yeah. And I saw one once that said, like, if we destroy our civilization like completely, we won't be doing it again because we've already exhausted the easy kind of fuels that power like an industrial revolution. We've gone through a
Yeah.
lot of the coal, we've used up a lot of the gas and natural gas and oil. So should we collapse to the point where we have to reinvent all that stuff, it's got to kind of be
Which
gone.
actually is an interesting point because that's kind of implied in Nightfall that this is a race.
Mm-hmm.
They know something is coming. Every 2049 years, this happens. And now we're down to the wire, and this is coming again, and it's a race. And I often feel like we're in a race right now of developing the technologies that will free us from all the things that are so easily taken away and will cause collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And, are we going to get to the finishing line before the ravening hordes drag us down and slit our throats again, so that we don't have to reinvent the material civilization that got us here in the first place? Can we get past this, please? And that's what they're trying to do in this story. So yeah, as a final point, that's an interesting.
Yeah. Can we make it to the
Can we
next
make it?
stage? Yeah.
Yeah, can we make it before the eclipse is
Mm.
final?
Good question. Can we make it before the eclipse? So those of you who are watching, ask yourself that. Can we make it before the eclipse?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll see you next time on Classic Reads. So remember, click the like and subscribe buttons and come back next time to see what we're going to talk about then. So thank you, Mark, for being with me again. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Take care.